closing argument happened yesterday. This is preceded by the judge in the case dropping the charge, the gun charge against Kyle Rittenhouse. According to ABC News, Rittenhouse was 17 when he shot 3 people, killing 2 with a semi-automatic rifle on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, during a protest against police brutality last year. I love how they characterize that. Not a bunch of people running around rioting. It was just a protest against police brutality. Prosecutors brought multiple charges against him, including first-degree intentional homicide, attempted homicide, reckless endangerment, and the firearm possession count. With legal experts saying prosecutors struggled to counter the Illinois man's claims of self-defense, the best bet for a conviction looked like the gun charge. But Rittenhouse defense team dug up an exception to the prohibition. Judge Bruce Schrader dismissed the count Monday, just hours before the jurors got the case. Under Wisconsin law, anyone under 18 who possesses a dangerous weapon is guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by up to 9 months behind bars. On its face, convicting Rittenhouse on that count looked like a legal slam dunk because he was 17 years old and obviously had the rifle strapped to his chest before the shooting. But Rittenhouse attorneys seized on a subsection of Wisconsin law that states the ban on minors possessing dangerous weapons applies to minors armed with rifles or shotguns only if those weapons are short-barreled. That language stems from a bill then Republican Governor Tommy Thompson signed in 1991. Lawmakers were trying to find ways to curb gang violence around that time. The goal was to prevent youths from carrying sawed-off shotguns. The AR-15 was not short-barreled. They asked Schrader to dismiss the possession count on those grounds at a pretrial hearing in October. The judge refused to toss the charge at that point. And then he did toss the charge because, again, the law is pretty specific. I mean, the law says that you're not allowed to carry a short-barreled shotgun or a short-barreled rifle, but it does not include these. I mean, if you draw the law that way, that is what the law is. So that charge was ruled out by the judge immediately. So basically, you are now down to the reckless endangerment charge. Reckless endangerment would be essentially shooting a gun in a crowded place, knowing that it might hit somebody. But that is going to be obviated by self-defense in this particular case, legally speaking. So the prosecution has nothing. And they really demonstrated that they had nothing yesterday. It was a bad closing argument for the prosecution. So the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor here is a guy named Thomas Binger. Binger made a mockery of himself throughout this trial. I mean, so much so that earlier in the trial, the judge reamed Binger for being bad at his job. Binger literally, he almost attempted to get a mistrial declared through his own activity. And he realized things were going so badly that it's almost hard to read this as anything except for him attempting to get a mistrial. He suggested in open court that Rittenhouse not talking to the cops was an admission of guilt, which has not been the case pretty much ever in common law, and certainly has not been the case in American case law for something like 40 or 50 years. Here was the judge reaming Binger earlier in the trial.
I was astonished when you began your examination by commenting on the defendant's post-arrest silence. That's basic law. It's been basic law in this country for 40 years, 50 years. I have no idea why you would do something like that. I said I had heard nothing in this trial to change any of my rulings. So why?
Testimony, Your Honor.
Pardon me?
That was before the defense testimony.
Don't get brazen with me. You're an experienced trial attorney, and you're telling me that when the judge says, I'm excluding this, you just to take it upon yourself to put it in because you think that you've found a way around it? Come on.
Okay, so it was a rough road for the prosecutors here. And they just demonstrated again, I don't know where they got their law degrees. Binger, I think, went to the University of Michigan Law School, which really does not speak highly of University of Michigan, for sure. Okay, so yesterday, he just made a mockery of himself. It was truly a terrible closing argument. He began by saying something just patently false, okay, which is if you bring a gun to a situation and then somebody attacks you and you shoot them, this means that you do not have the defense of self-defense available to you. That's not true in any way, shape, or form. If I bring a gun to an area where I'm legally allowed to bring a gun, even if I bring a gun to an area where I'm not legally allowed to bring a gun, you might get me on a gun charge, but if somebody attacks me with a knife and I shoot them, that is still self-defense. If somebody attacks me without a knife and I shoot them, that is still self-defense, depending on if I am in legitimate and reasonable fear for my life. Here is Binger just completely botching the law. Did he send like Cracker Jack box tops into the Bar Association to get a law degree? I don't understand how this guy is even practicing.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that when the defendant provokes the incident, he loses the right to self-defense. You cannot claim self-defense against a danger you create. That's critical right here. The defendant decided to pull the trigger on his AR-15 4 times. That was his decision. And he is responsible for every bullet that comes out of that gun.
So it is true that if you provoke a confrontation, you cannot then use self-defense. That part is true. But he literally said, this is a direct quote, you lose the right to self-defense when you're the one who brought the gun. Nope. False. Actively false. So the prosecution's case relies on the idea that Rittenhouse started a fight essentially with Joseph Rosenbaum, and that everything that thereupon followed was Rittenhouse's fault. But there's no evidence that that's the case. Okay, and so instead, you see the prosecutor making Binger it was bizarre. Here he was defending Joseph Rosenbaum. Joseph Rosenbaum spent the evening being totally insane. Spent the evening burning things, threatening people with chains, literally saying, according to witness testimony, that he would kill Rittenhouse if he found him alone. And Binger just decides that the only way to prosecute Rittenhouse is to pretend that Joseph Rosenbaum was actually like a wonderful dude. So here he is, clip 14, explaining that Joseph Rosenbaum really didn't do anything that night. He's just a non-threatening, kind of silly, idiot little guy who really, there was nothing to fear from Joseph Rosenbaum while he was like threatening people with chains and burning cars and such.
He just happens to stumble into it. So what does he do that night? Oh, let me tell you all the awful things Joseph Rosenbaum did. He tipped over a porta potty that had no one in it. He swung a chain. He lit a metal garbage dumpster on fire. Oh, and there's this empty wooden flatbed trailer that they pulled out in the middle of the road, and they tipped it over to stop some bearcats, and they lit it on fire. Oh, and he said some bad words. He said the N-word.
What the hell is wrong with this guy? Like, really, I don't know what's wrong with him. And by the way, all of the offenses that he mentions before the N-word offense, which, by the way, according to the media, is the gravest offense in American public life. If you use the N-word, we bar you from public society. We basically brand you and say that you are no longer allowed to participate in public society in America. He's like, well, he said the N-word. But also, like, all the other stuff that you're saying is criminal. Okay, it's actual criminal activity. It's like, so he was rioting. So he was burning things. So he was setting up barricades to prevent the cops from getting in. So was that big a deal? Like, he seems like a nice guy. Was he just maybe like a bad night? How many times have you just been walking down the street and you set a metal dumpster on fire, tipped over a porta potty, started waving around chains, shouting the N-word and tried to block the cops from coming? Happens all the time. Happens all the time. That's the prosecutor. You remember, prosecutors are supposed to be angry at people for violating the law. That's kind of their job. It's like, well, his violations of law are no big deal. And then he goes even further. He suggests that this is a mob of heroes. Now, you watched the tape. Did that look like a mob of heroes to you? The people chasing Kyle Rittenhouse? Did that look like a group of people out for justice that evening? Or did that look like a bunch of people who are out to make trouble and burn things and create violence and havoc? And did it look like they were chasing down Kyle Rittenhouse to beat the living hell out of him? Like before the shooting. Remember, he's being chased by Rosenbaum and other people before he shoots anyone. Literally for not doing anything. So here's the prosecutor trying to make the case that this was a group of heroes. Who are you going to believe? The narrative of your own eyes.
We've had several police officers testify that in an active shooter situation, their first instinct, their first training is to go in and stop the threat. They don't sit there and wonder, well, maybe it was self-defense. I don't know. I'm going to, wait and see. And every day we read about heroes that stop active shooters. That's what was going on here. And that crowd was right. And that crowd was full of heroes.
That crowd was full of heroes? The actual F? What in the world? It gets worse from here, by the way. Binger decided it would be a great idea to point a gun at like the entire room. So, number one, he is violating pretty much every standard of gun safety right now. Like, there are pictures of Rittenhouse walking around in the middle of the riots and obeying the basic rules of gun safety, like don't have your finger inside the trigger guard. Here is Binger with it. I mean, it's like Alec Baldwin over here. He's pointing an actual AR-15 style weapon at the jury because guns are scary, guys. And if Kyle Rittenhouse had a gun and guns are scary, that means he's guilty in some way. And he's got his finger inside the trigger guard. Like, what? I'm sorry, this guy's a mockery. He's a mock. And then his deputy shows up. His deputy prosecutor is a guy named James Krause. And honest to God, if this guy if this guy Binger got his law degree from the University of Cracker Jack boxes, then James Krause, the ADA, apparently got his degree from like a Special K mail-in game. Because, my God, he then makes the case that Rittenhouse should have fought these people with his fists. He says that if somebody attacks you with their fists, they're obviously not going to do anything deadly to you, so you're a coward if you shoot them, if they're trying to beat the hell out of you with a skateboard. You have to take the beating.
Clearly, if there is provocation, he's guilty. But even outside of provocation, why do you get to immediately just start shooting? As Mr. Binger said, he brought a gun to a fist fight. And he was too cowardly to use his own fist to fight his way out.
Okay, so a few things. I noticed that he brought a gun to a gunfight, considering that Gage Grosskreutz was showing up with a gun. Also, he brought a gun to a being smashed in the face with a skateboard fight. Also, he brought a gun to a somebody grabbing for his gun fight. Since I have a question, since when in American law is the rule that if somebody threatens your life with not a gun, you're not allowed to use a gun to protect your own life? When is that the rule in American law, ever? And so it was a real bad day for the prosecution. The defense, by contrast, had a pretty easy day because all they had to point out is the obvious. This is a political case. So here's the defense attorney, Mark Richards, making the point that this is a political case, which it clearly was.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a political case. We can take politics out of it as in Democrat and Republican, but the district attorney's office is marching forward with this case because they need somebody to be responsible. They need somebody to put and say, we did it. He's the person who brought terror to Kenosha. Kyle Rittenhouse is not that individual. The rioters, the demonstrators who turned into rioters, those are the individuals who bring us forth.
Okay, that is correct. Okay, and then Richard says, very controversially, that he's glad he shot Joseph Rosenbaum. Well, I mean, I don't know about being glad that anybody got shot, but if somebody's grabbing for a gun and they get shot, that is the predictable result of grabbing for somebody's gun.
Kyle shot Joseph Rosenbaum to stop a threat to his person. And I'm glad he shot him, because if Joseph Rosenbaum had got that gun, I don't for a minute believe he wouldn't have used it against somebody else. He was irrational and crazy.
Okay, and not just that, Richards then says that it's impossible. Binger had said it was impossible for Rosenbaum to have threatened Rittenhouse. That's, of course, untrue, and Richards points that out.
We showed the video to start this, clearly depicting Mr. Rosenbaum standing there at Car Source 2 shortly after the dumpster, standing there with his chain, the shirt tied up over his head. But Mr. Binger says it's impossible for him to have threatened my client. That's garbage, just like his case.
Yep. And then Richards concludes by saying that Binger apparently lives in fairy tale land because he's just making up stories.
This active shooter BS is something that Mr. Binger is trying to sell you people. Has he shot anybody since Car Source 3? No, he hasn't. He's running to try and get to the police. Mr. Binger must live in fairy tale land to think that Kyle could stop, put his gun down, and say, hey, everything's good, leave me alone, I'm going to the police. Unfortunately, that's not how the real world works.
Alrighty, so in just 1 second, we'll get to the media's final take on this particular situation, because at a certain point, you have to imagine that they want the riots. Mischaracterizing the case as poorly as they have done throughout this case demonstrates they want something out of this. And apparently what they want is more violence and more unrest, because the narrative, uber alles, the only thing that matters is the narrative. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.